Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you. Welcome here tonight. I'm so happy to have you with us here tonight. My name is Annie Fraser, and I work here at the Capgemini Applied Innovation Exchange in San Francisco. For those of you who have never heard of Capgemini is a global consulting firm headquartered in Paris, France, but with offices pretty much everywhere, roughly 200,000 employees globally, if that gives you any ideas to the scale of organization that we are. Just a quick show of hands, actually. Who here has been to the Applied Innovation Exchange before? Awesome. Well, welcome to have, or so great to have you come back and join us here tonight. For those of you who may be a little bit less familiar about what we do here at the AIE, as we like to call it, we effectively work with Capgemini clients who tend to be large, traditional, complex organizations, often Fortune 500 companies who are feeling very outpaced by the advancements in technology and innovation that they're seeing in their industries. And we work with them to identify problems and opportunities and work with them throughout a process to eventually help them land at solutions, leveraging principles of open innovation. So by leveraging our network of partners internally across Capgemini, leveraging external partners, things like startups, VCs, academics, enterprise partners, organizations of that nature. But in addition to the work that we do with clients, we also host a variety of events and initiatives aimed at engaging the broader community. So events like the What's Now series, which is an amazing series and has created a lot of impact for our team, thanks to Pete and his team. And we do all of this in the spirit of exchange. So as a way to be able to capture the most relevant conversations that are happening in our space, but also as a way for us to share our knowledge and our insight back with the community around us, and eventually, or ultimately, just to give back to the surrounding community. And just a quick announcement before I forget, one such event that we're actually doing in partnership with our AIE in Singapore is a hackathon. We've got information on this hackathon available at the front for those who are interested, but it's a hackathon aimed at challenges in global banking and global financial services, but it should be a really interesting event. There's still time to register, so if anyone here is interested in potentially registering or finding out more, please look for these flyers that are available throughout the space and particularly at the front. But just wanted to thank you all again for joining us tonight, and with that, I'll hand it over to Pete to officially kick off the event.
Thank you. No, I got it here. Thank you. Thanks, and thanks to Capgemini. I want to thank them. Lanny's here, Chief Innovation Officer. Bob is here, has been here for many years. A lot of the team here. And I say thanks because we have just finished our third full year of this series, and we are now into our fourth year of this. And when you go back to the start of this series, it was when they were first opening the space out. They just had come here, they had just opened this space, and they were thinking, what can we do to use this asset as, as an asset for the community? How can we give back? How can we kind of feed the commons? And that's when they approached me and Reinvent, my company Reinvent. I said, there's one thing that's missing in this ecosystem, the Bay Area, for all the innovation that's going on. There's no kind of series that systematically goes through all the different areas that are just exploding in innovation all over the space. And it'd be a real service to go to each one of those, get some remarkable person who's doing something amazing in that space, have them explain what's happening, explain why it's important for people outside that field, and actually talk about what they think is coming in the near future. And so 3 years later, we have done dozens and dozens of these things now, and we have systematically worked our way through really this whole ecosystem. And we're able to see the parallels and the synergies between these different fields, but also what makes them unique, something unique in each field that we can all kind of learn from. And so in the process of doing that, we've also knitted together this amazing network of folks from many different backgrounds that really has this enriched exploring of all this ecosystem, this innovative ecosystem of the Bay Area. And it wouldn't have been without Capgemini's vision and their generosity to really do this. So I really want to thank you guys. And I think it's, as we enter year 4 here, thank you. In fact, let's give a hand for all that they did. So one of the things about this series so far is in going to all these different fields, a lot of these fields are relatively straightforward, like, hey, we're looking at AI, we're looking at space technology, we're looking at, virtual reality, whatever. Those are kind of, people can kind of understand them because we're a very high-tech kind of area. Some of them are around kind of things like clean energy or climate policy. Again, outsiders can kind of get that. But there's one category of fields, I would think of them, is more opaque, more difficult, even for very sophisticated, smart audiences, people who outside that field to really understand. And that's the life sciences. And that's spaces like biotech, genetics, neuroscience. These are fields that really takes a different kind of lens. They operate in different pace. They have different kind of rules. They have different kind of constraints. They aren't as clearly parallel to what happens in these other tech fields, these other innovation spaces in the Bay Area. And so but at the same time, they're extremely important. And a lot of the developments that are happening in this space are going to have huge impact on our lives, on our health, and on really the way society is going to be shaped in the coming years here. And so when you go to those spaces, you really need to find the right guide. You need someone who really can understand, knows the background, the history, can understand kind of the distinction and the differences from these other tech fields, but also the kind of things that are in parallel. And really just kind of give a good idea of what's realistically coming, what's truly coming realistically in the next 10 years or so. And so that's what we've got tonight. We have got one of those guides, Linda Avey, who has really spent pretty much her whole career in this life science space. And she's a Gaia? A Gaia, okay, a Gaia. She was the co-founder of really one of the groundbreaking companies here in the Bay Area in this life science space, 23andMe. Way back in 2006, I think it was, when they started that, which really opened up the entire genetic testing to consumers, really opened up a whole field that has just been rolling for the last decade there. She's also then now recently, this is kind of, as that spread through the developed world and through the United States, and everyone's getting their ancestry and everything else that they know now, she's now putting her brain onto how do we expand it more globally, and particularly her new company Precisely is looking at particularly the market of India, which for a bunch of reasons doesn't have that same kind of reception right yet to this kind of technologies. And so we're extremely lucky to have someone who can tell us the past, the present, and the future of this field. And to do that, let's welcome Linda Avey. Come on. Good to see you. So great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. And one of the things I thought besides we share a Midwestern kind of heritage. I grew up in Minnesota. She grew up in South Dakota. So besides, we're not
just everybody say it now. I've never met anybody from South Dakota. I get that all the time.
So we're not going to go that far in the story.
Thank God.
But what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the early part of the Human Genome Project, which really launched in 1990, I think it was. And I was just going to, and she was involved in the early period of that, in the very beginning of the sequencing of the human genome. And I just wanted her to kind of give us a sense of where the state of the field was in trying to just begin to wrap our heads around how do we crack the human genome, how do we sequence it, the cost of that. Just give us, what was it like back then, which wasn't that long ago, but
it was
early 90s.
Yeah, it was a company here, of course, in San Francisco, the Bay Area, called Applied Biosystems back in the day that created the first technology to read the genome, really. It was all born here, not surprisingly. So I was aware of the company. I wasn't working for them in the very, very early stages, but we were all following that with great interest. And Applied Bio, or ABI, which then became known as Arrogant Beyond Imagination, because they were a company that really pretty much owned the whole DNA sequencing market. And so things were really starting to pick up, and the technology in the early days was really crappy, and it was really expensive, and not a lot of labs could even afford to use it. But it was the beginning inkling that, wow, we really could start to understand the human genome with this technology. And so there were talks with the government. The NIH really kind of got onto this bandwagon of we really need to sequence the human genome. And as the government would do, they did it by committee, and they decided to break the genome into chunks and spread it all over the world and get it into all these labs and try to get it sequenced, and it was going horribly. And I was I was in sales at the time, and my manager was like putting the thumb on me, like, where are these orders and why aren't they coming in? And it was because it was so disorganized, and we just weren't seeing the progress. So Applied Biosystems, which was waiting to sell all these sequencers to all these labs, had the brilliant idea of, well, why don't we just start a company and do it ourselves? And so that was where Celera was created, this company Celera, which was a spin-out of Applied Biosystems. And as we know, competition can drive a lot of things. And that's what really got the government project and all of these dispersed labs to get their acts more together. There's a great book about this called The Genome Wars, I think. And it's a great read if you're, I mean, it's really nerdy, geeky, goes into the science and everything. But what's interesting is when I read that, and I knew Craig Venter, who started Celera. I've known him for many years. But what I didn't realize, and the person who wrote the book, I think, was pretty neutral to both parties that were involved in this project. And he would go to meetings at Celera, a private company, and they would let him in to the conference room to hear what was going on. Whereas the government project would be, oh no, we have to close the doors. We can't let journalists and people in here, which is kind of ironic that it broke out that way. But lo and behold, in the year 2000, it was President Clinton who forced these enemies, really, the head of Celera, Craig Venter, and Francis Collins, who pretty much ran the Human Genome Project, to come together and shake hands and say, we've done the first draft. So, and the numbers vary on what the cost was, anywhere from $300 million to $3 billion, depending on how you add it all up. But insanely expensive, but it spawned so many amazing things. You hear people grumble a little bit about what we've really learned from the data. But I think if you look at the big picture, it's amazing. It's incredible what we've learned from that project, and it was well worth it.
Can I get that? There we go. Just to bring that up one bit is, so there was one piece was the government was committed to this kind of moonshot kind of idea at some level.
Yeah.
Yet it was also having competition with the private sector to kind of get both sides moving faster. Because I think the original government thing was that it was going to take
forever. Yeah.
But so do you see that as a model, a useful model, and one that came out pretty well to kind of apply to other big challenges in this kind of
absolutely
in this biotech
yeah.
space?
I think it's human nature. If we don't have something pushing us, we're not going to take the quicker path. And the grumbling also came from the way Craig Venter was doing the sequencing was through what they call shotgun, and he needed kind of the government project to help to assemble the work that he was doing. So he was actually kind of he was using their work to to enable what he was doing. So it was very complementary in that sense. But yeah, I think it drives progress in so many different fields, and certainly we saw that there.
So the first draft of the human genome, which is basically the sequencing of all the human beings' genes.
Craig Venter's. He slipped his genome in with unbeknownst to everyone.
Oh, really? Oh, okay,
yeah,
so
that's a little inside scoop.
But they often talk about 2003 as it was finally the kind of end of the whole project at that level. And so you form 23andMe as one of the co-founders, three co-founders, in 2006.
Yeah.
So talk about that period of the early 2000s there, where this huge project's done. Did it kind of start all the wheels turning of entrepreneurial ventures of what could we do with this stuff?
Absolutely.
And talk a little bit about that and maybe the early origins of 23andMe.
Yeah, well, so the minute you have a draft of the sequence, now you have, and the DNA is just a beautiful molecule to analyze. It was like it was designed to be read and studied, unlike proteins, which are really difficult. So we have this draft sequence, and now we know how to go in and read the genome because we know where all these bases are, and we can create probes and ways to go in and actually read more genomes. And so it just spawned all kinds of companies and technologies, and Affymetrix was one of the first companies, also here in the Bay Area, that was started and was giving people the ability to go in and read the genome, not the whole genome, but really important parts of the genome. And then there was a company that spun out of that called Perligen Sciences. So I was working for Perligen back in 2003, just literally a few years after we had this draft. And the CEO of that company was able to raise $100 million, and he resequenced. They call it resequencing because you're using the data you got from the first draft to resequence 50 genomes, 2 million a pop. And he got the funding. People here in the Bay Area just doled out the cash, and That work then created now additional information to allow us to really dive into the genome in a big way. And
So in other words, we went from, let's say, 3 billion or 300 million to 3 billion for one genome to now, what did you say, 50 million for one?
it was 2 million.
Or 2 million for
per
one.
genome, yeah. And
So
it,
now we dropped it down to
Yes.
2 million.
Right, exactly. So that happened, and then from there, we were able to create now kind of new ways to index the genome based on that information that was generated from Perligen. And then it created this thing called the HapMap project, which the government also did, and also Perligen, we did our own HapMap, where you're basically going into the different groups of humans and looking for patterns of variation in these groups. I don't, if you want to call them ethnic groups, whatever, but those studies then were able to kind of map the differences between two humans, and you could tell, well, this person is totally African and this person is European. We had that ability to do that after the work that was done in the HapMap project. So then by the time that came along, then we were able to create chips that could read the genome, whole genome they called it. It wasn't really truly whole genome, but you can kind of infer a lot of the genome if you have certain points in it. And so that process allowed us to do large-scale whole genome studies, they were called. And that really started to spawn all kinds of discoveries of associations with diseases and traits and all these other things. And so all of this was going on in the, this 2003, 2005 timeframe. And my job was to go out and find DNA samples to put into these studies, and we were having a difficulty finding DNA. Saliva sample, or not even saliva. We were looking for blood at the time, and I was going everywhere, pounding on all the doors all over the country, all over the world for that matter, just trying to find access to DNA samples. And so that was sort of going on, and I was like, why is this so hard? There are so many people. If you go to talk to a disease organization, like a not-for-profit, they'll tell you, oh, we have hundreds of patients, and they would be dying to give you a sample. But organizing that and finding the funding to do it was very difficult. So it was just seeing these challenges that were going on in the research space, and that was my job, really. That was part of the thing where a light bulb went on, like, all these people seem really interested in sharing their data. Why can't we just give them a way to do that? They very willingly would do that. So that was one of the things. And then there was another thing that happened. I went to a trade show, and I was just walking through all the exhibit hall, and there was this table with these little tubes on it that said you can get DNA from saliva. And it was like another light bulb went on, like, whoa, if we could simply just have somebody spit in a tube and we could get their DNA from that, that would be outrageous. It would be so easy. We wouldn't have to go in and draw blood from people. So that's another big step change. That there was this other light that went off, and then just the funding part. People would try to get grants. Maybe they found enough DNA to do a study, but they didn't. They just didn't have enough grant money to pay for it. I saw, in fact, there was one particular study at UCSF where they were working with Kaiser, and they had DNA from kids with epilepsy, and it was a pretty exciting study. And then they got their funding amount, and they had to cut it in half. And so their statistical power just went out the window. Now you see this going on, and it's so frustrating. So all of this stuff kind of converged in my head, and then I was the person who had to be the guinea pig to spit in the tube, because I took one of these back to our lab at Perligen and was like, you guys, this could be pretty cool. And they were like, all right, go ahead and spit. And I was like, all right. And then they came back. I went back to the lab and said, well, how did it work? And they were like, it was amazing. And then it was like, oh, my DNA is sitting on a computer here somewhere. I want it. And it was that feeling of, that's my data. And you don't ever have that sense until you know it's actually there. And then you're like, oh, I have to have that. And so all of that stuff sort of all happened. And I was like, maybe there's a company in all of this. This could be kind of crazy.
Wow, what a story. Just explain one more time, why was it so hard to get the DNA? I mean, it's because it took a lot of money to mass it, but why wouldn't people just say, awesome, I would have volunteered,
it is mostly the funding.
It's the funding, to get the funding together to do a $2 million.
You can collect, and there were a lot of biobanks that you could get samples from, but they were, then you had all the cost of reading the genomes from the samples.
Got you. Okay, so you got this situation, you got this stew, you're in another company with that. So how did you form the company then? So give us a little bit of the origin myth of how you formed
Well,
it.
I had moved from Perligen to Affymetrix, which was this company making these gene chips, and I was part of a running group of VPs. I was a total peon at the company. Sorry. And so we're out there running in the morning, and I start telling them these ideas, and they're like, you should really go to the CEO of Affy and tell him about this. And I was like, hell no, I'm not going to go talk to Steve Fodor about this. And they were like, Linda, you totally should. So I got a meeting with Steve. I went into his office shaking like a leaf. And he was like, go do it. I'll give you $10 million. Whatever you need to do, just go start that company. And I was like, what? I was pretty blown away that he was just immediately supportive of it. But he did say, you've got to leave. You can't do this with an Affymetrix because people would think that's too weird. Because everybody kind of was creeped out by the idea, but at the same time they were like, we got to do this. This is really great. So that was what did it. And I was like, all right, I'm going. I'm going to go do this thing.
Fantastic. And then there are two other co-founders. So how did you, the early days there, because it sounds like you hadn't done a company, you didn't know how to go.
Mm-hmm.
But you were able with $10 million, I suppose, to get a lot of people to come together.
Well, he offered the $10 million.
Yeah.
So my first co-founder was Paul Kusenza. Paul and I had worked together at Perligen, and he's an operational guy. He's an engineer by training, but he's the detail guy, and I'm not. And I thought, I need an operational person to do this with. And so I called him up. He lives in DC, and he's like, okay, whatever, let's do it. Let's get it together. And then the other thing that had happened is I had met Sergey Brin at a meeting with the Michael J. Fox Foundation out here in California, and I was working with them on a Parkinson's study with Michael J. Fox. They gave us $2 million to do a project at Perligen. So I'd met the Fox people, and they came out to California to tell their donors out here where their money was going. And so Sergey showed up at this meeting along with Andy Grove. And Sergey came up to me, of all people, and started grilling me on statistical power and how you do this genetics research. And
this is just,
sorry.
co-founder of Google, just for anyone that didn't follow
And
that.
his mother has Parkinson's. He's been very public about that. And so I met him, and I thought, God, he seems to be interested in genetics and this whole research that we're doing. So I stayed in touch with him, and I kept pinging him. And so that's how I met his girlfriend, Anne. And we kept running into each other here and there, and she kept grilling me about the company, like, what about this and what about that? And we were actually, I think, at TED in 2005 or 2006, February 2006. And she, finally at the end of TED, we were getting ready, in Monterey, back in the good old days, we were getting into our cars to leave, and she came up and she said, I think I want to do this with you. And it was like this stunning moment I'll never forget of, oh my God, this means Google's going to support this company. And I just felt like, this is awesome. So that was kind of how the three of us all came together.
Great little story. And I'm going through this a little slow here just because I think it's a classic story of just the serendipity, but also just the networks, the kind of risks, the leap of faith, the kind of, it has all the elements. And that's just innovation. It just takes place in weird ways.
And but the thing that most people don't know, and I'm curious how many people here I should have asked earlier, how many people have done 23andMe? I mean, I kind of would think this crowd would probably be pretty up on it.
How many people have done just some kind of
any kind of genetic test?
Anything like Ancestry and things like that, as well as, so the hands of them and the 23andMe's? So it's a big chunk. Yeah. But anyhow...
but the research part of it that drove really the first beginnings of the ideas for it, it gets lost on a lot of people until finally the word started coming out about the research that was actually going on in the back end. I mean, we called it 23andWe. We had a logo that Slack actually stole. We had a really cool square logo, which was Slack's first logo. I have no idea how they copied it. But it was really that drive that I was most excited about. And that was really, and now that's really what has been driving the fundraising for the company. They raised, what was it, $300 million or something like that with GSK to really do more of the drug discovery end of the business. So that really did take off.
So the early days, just one last thing about your 23andMe piece. Early days, did you find it really slow going because it was such pioneering turf, or did you find it like an open field, like you could just run because no one knew what the hell you were doing?
Kind of both. I mean, so I think we started way too early, and our
early in the development of the technologies and stuff.
Well, and the cost for the most part. So when we launched 23andMe, it was $1,000, $999 to do it. We were insane to think anybody would pay that much money for it, and so business was just dribbling in, and it was really slow going. But I don't know that I would do it any differently because we kind of needed the time to figure out how we're going to communicate this information to people. It gave us, I think, the runway we needed to figure out that interface and that type of communication. And of course, we didn't get it right. This was back in the day. It's funny because back then, it doesn't seem like that long ago, but user testing wasn't really anywhere near what it is now. And we actually stuck Anne's mom in front of a terminal and said, okay, go do it. And she had no idea what to do. And she finally got to the place where you can actually download your raw data, which is the last place we wanted her to end up on the website. And we were just like, how did you get there? It was, so we learned the hard way that user testing is super important. And we had one of our investors who's a really smart guy from Europe, and he came in and he was yelling. He was in our office. Ann and I shared an office, and he was in there yelling at us like, "I am not stupid." And we felt really stupid because it was a challenge.
Fair enough. So, just kind of looking at that field, so it's only been a little over 10 years in the field. And have you felt good about how it's grown, how it's filled out, particularly in the developed world? I mean, or are you frustrated by it didn't go far enough, fast enough, or whatever? I'm just curious what's the story of the last 10 years that, from your point of view, that's been useful?
Well, I think what really, again, the competitive thing, right? It wasn't until Ancestry kind of came into the market and started advertising like crazy. And this was after I'd left 23andMe. And then it was just like, okay, all bets are off. The marketing budgets just went through the roof, and suddenly you're seeing ads all over the place. That's really what drove the spike in the business, the up and to the right. It's just, that happened. And it's just been insane to see the numbers now. But it was a really slow ramp. And I think it really took the advertising. And then the other thing that happened, of course, is the cost of the technology just continued to drop. I'll never forget when we met with the CEO of Illumina, and he was really excited. We could tell he was just almost agitated, and we're like, what's going on? And he's like, you guys, we can drop the price of this down to $399 from $999. So we had a big drop, and that was super exciting. So that continued to happen, and it's still happening. I mean, I think we're kind of getting to a point where it's not going to get a whole lot lower. But
what is it now, roughly? Do you know?
Well, if you do the Ancestry service, you can get it usually for $49. And with 23andMe, you can get more of the health reports. After the FDA debacle, now health reports are kind of coming back into the service. So I think that's about $199 for that part of it. But Ancestry they do all kinds of discounting, and they use the exact same technology as 23andMe. So you're getting basically the same data from both.
So we went from 3 billion to 2 million to 1,000 to $49.
Yep, pretty much.
In the space of a decade, probably.
It's insane. It's
so
crazy that it happened. But the difference is that initial work was done sequencing the entire genome, and now you can get that for maybe, I don't know, $400, something like $500 probably.
$500
for the whole thing.
For your whole DNA sequence.
All 6 billion bases. Yep.
Crazy, and you wonder why tech is so disruptive. It's kind of like, whoa, that's the cost curves.
Yeah,
it's just
exactly. It's insane.
Okay, but now so this is kind of filled out in the developed world, but you're now a new company, Precisely, is looking globally. And talk a little bit about how this is happening globally, because I was quite surprised. You said there's a lot going on in China, and you started to talk about the different regions of the world that are now adapting these now cheap technologies. Can you say a little bit more about the global point of perspective on this?
So, and particularly with India. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was this project to go and map the variation across all the different groups of humans. And so, at the time, India decided to opt out of that project. They just decided, we've had it with colonialism, we're going to be independent. We don't want to give our data to Europe or the US. And so because they opted out, they kind of got behind in really the understanding of their genome compared to other parts of the world. So that was one of their setbacks, I would say. And then most research is funded by Europe and the US, by the NIH and NHS and some of these other large government organizations. And so we were not getting...
Is there a mic hit? We're losing the mic a little bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's off. You can hear me? Oh, good. Okay, awesome. And so we were seeing all this great research happening, but it was mostly happening in Caucasians and in white folk, and it was not happening as much in people of other ethnicities. And so that's another reason why a study will come out and it'll be like, yeah, but it was just done in Europeans. And so we started to hear that at 23andMe, like we would put it we wanted to be very explicit in our health reports of where the research was done and who it applied to. And a lot of times it was like, this was done in a European population. There was a bit in China, but certainly not studies that were being done in India. And I actually went through at one point and researched geneticists in India, and almost all of them were plant geneticists. They were really focused on feeding their population. And so there wasn't a lot of emphasis, and this was earlier, like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. There wasn't a lot going on in human genetics in India. So it feels like it's a white space that's open for going in and doing something really major in that country.
So, just you mentioned China. What's going on in China? Is there a lot of activity in this? So there was a company started, I forget when they started, but they're called Beijing Genomics Institute, BGI, and they were an early entrant into doing, it's kind of like, if you know the Broad Institute here in the US in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they got tons of funding, and they're just these big sequencing shops. They go and they just spend money and they buy the boxes and they just start pushing DNA through like crazy. And BGI was one of those companies in China that was doing that as well. And so they started generating a ton of data. And we're seeing this going on in India, right? Or I'm sorry, in China, where there's just all this innovation happening. And a lot of scientists who've been trained in the US are going back to China. And so they're, if anything, they're really getting ahead, I would say, because there are different restrictions there, I think, around consent. Some of them... Less constriction.
Yeah, and I think they have more freedom to operate, potentially, than we do here. But they're doing some really great work, and there are some amazing scientists there.
So just to push that a little bit, so less concern with privacy, would you say, and kind of open data? I mean, because we had Kai-Fu Lee here, which for those that might have been here, again, talking the same thing about AI, it's able to get accelerated development there because there's a lot less boundaries between data sets and aggregating data and trying new things. And it's an interesting
different
tension,
mindsets.
a little tension, but interesting about that. Can you say much more about what you're doing in India, or it sounds like you're kind of more in stealth mode right now?
Well, a bit. We're just there exploring. We're leaving again for our 4th trip this year, so it's been, my co-founder Anil is here with me. We're just really trying to figure out the whole landscape. The thing that's really interesting about India is that there are about 4,600 subpopulations in the country. And these are sort of artificially formed by these groups that came together and decided, with the caste system and everything else, that they sort of enforced separation. And you can see that now in their genomes. So you can see groups that have been intermarrying for a long time, endogamy has been going on. And it makes for, like, everybody's probably heard of Iceland, right? Iceland is this place where people moved and then they stayed very isolated. And so it's a really interesting population to study from a genetics perspective. Well, India has that in spades. There are like thousands of Icelands in India. So it's but it also then represents challenges because you can't just say we have the Indian genome and now we know how to read this population. We've got to go and map a lot of these in order to really understand what's going on at the subpopulation level. And then not only that, but a lot of them have their own languages. And so communicating with them, when we first started thinking about this, everybody's like, oh, English is fine. And now we're finding out, oh, it absolutely is not fine. People speak English, but when they're in their family unit, they're speaking their home language or their village language or whatever. And so it represents a lot of challenges for us to create a product that's going to be useful and meaningful to people there.
Okay, so we're kind of crossing in the turf from what we can do now into what we can soon do. And so what I'm interested in is, there's the ancestry thing, and that's useful. But what else, what's the next stage of use cases that we could start to do? And you had mentioned something like a lot of diseases, for example, are monogenetic. We were chatting a little bit before. And so we can now, through these scans, identify who has certain genes that are with a maybe not an inevitability of the
Sometimes
disease.
But
but tell us a little bit about what's the next stage for what we could do with this knowledge, or this cheap ability to understand everybody's genome?
Well, so what's interesting is that if you look at countries like India, where because they have this endogamy, they have a lot of, this intermarriage going on with people that might be semi-related. And in cases like that, then you can have people who are carriers for a disease that's well known and well characterized. We know what these genes are, but they marry and then they have children who have these very devastating conditions like thalassemia, sickle cell disease. It's a very unfortunate thing that goes on there. We don't see that as much here because we don't have arranged marriages and we don't have the same kind of effect from just the culture and the way people here, you end up marrying somebody from across from New York and LA and whatever. We don't have these little villages as much. And so I think in the developing world, we have an opportunity because we know exactly what causes these diseases. It's clear as day. We just have to get the information. It's a communication problem. We need to get the information out to these families and talk to them about what they can do to prevent babies from being born with these conditions. We don't have to go use fancy things like CRISPR to fix it. We can just help them so that they have healthy children. And so I think there's huge opportunity there in the developing world. And here it's the more esoteric, the more multigenic conditions like cancers and things that we're actually making great strides in that as well. And so I think depending on where you are in the world, I do believe genetic information is going to be one of the leading drivers in us figuring out human disease.
So what about CRISPR now? I mean, so let's say or talk a little bit more about what's happening in cancer. Because I think what's interesting is, what I'm trying to understand is, to what extent could these potential changes, this ability to do things, almost literally transform public health, everything?
Well,
yeah. So in other words, but just walk us through that. Like, so you can identify these genes of these diseases. Mm-hmm. Could you snip them out and and would that affect that individual or just only their children? Or, I mean, how do you start thinking about the possibilities here? Well,
I mean, so there's rare disease, which are these more monogenic ones, right, where you get this big genetic hit, and it's inevitable. Things like Huntington's disease and sickle cell and all of these, where it's a very clear genetic problem. Those potentially could be fixed with CRISPR. If you have the unfortunate event of a baby born with a very serious condition like that, and there are tons of rare diseases. I forget the number, but there are babies being born every day where they have a condition that's not even diagnosed. And so that's where actually DNA sequencing, where you can go in and now read at a relatively low cost the entire genome of a baby with a problem. And typically what you do is you read the parents as well, so you have this trio of data from both parents and the child, and you can say, okay, what changed? The parents were seemingly healthy, but now they have this baby with this problem, and then you can sift through and find out, okay, where were the big hits? Where are the differences? And this goes on now all the time. Stanford has a program for this, of looking at undiagnosed disease. How do we figure it out? And genetics has played a huge role in that. And so then once you find that big hit that happened, then you can look at, okay, what gene is it in? What does that gene do? And then how can we try to fix this problem? So that's going on now all the time.
And you can do that in the baby whose life then will be fine without that disease? Or
theoretically, yes. I mean, CRISPR is a pretty new technology, but we're seeing companies sprout up left and right. There's still a huge patent battle going on between the Broad Institute and UC Berkeley. Go Bears. I'm really hopeful that a public institution from the UC could retain some of the things that I think they truly did invent. And I think there was a lot of money at the Broad. I'm sorry, now my prejudice is coming out, but
that's
East
fine.
Coast versus West Coast. But yeah, I think there's just huge opportunity, and there's going to be a lot of money to be made in that field.
So just for people that don't fully get that, including me, so what is the actual battle over right now between the?
It's just it gets really esoteric, but just the patents around the CRISPR technology. Are being debated. And we thought it was settled, and apparently it just came up again where there's another suit, where I think Berkeley is trying to claw back some of the rights that they have.
But so let's assume that legal battle gets through. But so you could do this nipping, and could you then also, if two people are going to get married and you see these genes, could you clip them so that for sure the kid would not have those?
Well, there are far easier ways to do that with PGD. It's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you actually fertilize the eggs and then you go in and analyze them and say, okay, this one looks healthy. Let's implant that one. Mm-hmm. So going to the lengths of actually going in and trying to fix a genome is still very challenging. And so everybody's probably heard about the baby that was born, or the twins that were born in China that were CRISPR babies. And what the scientists there did, there's this thing called CCR5. And if you've got this one mutation, or a double mutation in CCR5, it means that you will not get AIDS. You can be exposed to HIV, and you'll just never get AIDS. And it's just a mechanism of the cell that the virus can't actually enter into the cell. And it's very complicated, but the bottom line is that they did CRISPR on these twins, and there was some, I forget what the whole story was. There was something about the parents of this child. I think the father I don't know if he has AIDS or something, but there was a concern about this. So they thought, well, this is a great experiment. We'll have these two babies have this CCR5 mutation, and they won't be able to get AIDS. Isn't that great? Well, now we're finding out that there are problems with that. There's always the consequences that you didn't think through, and there are certainly unintended things here that'll potentially happen, like their lives might be shortened. There are things that will be follow-on effects of that. So the minute you go in there and try to tweak things, it's not as straightforward as people think.
It's still very early days, so
yeah,
could be done. A couple of questions, and by the way, we're going to be shifting to conversation with all of you, and there's a lot of experts I know in this space.
I'm sure there are people out here who know way more than I do.
No, that's not true, but it'll be some good conversations here. So we all know healthcare is extremely expensive. The system here sucks, all the stuff we know, and yet we're trying to figure out, these kind of 20th century ideas of Medicaid for all and all kinds of stuff. It's more of a funding thing. But do you see the breakthroughs happening in genetics and potentially biotech and other things? I mean, are we like 10 years out or 20 years out for an absolute transformation in healthcare in a way that if everybody knew their genome from the beginning, if we could kind of snip things out, if we could, prescribe personalized medicine for individuals at a cheap cost? I mean, are we heading towards some kind of rare shift? Maybe not. I mean, I'm just trying to understand from outside.
The thing is, things always look like they happen faster when you look in a rearview mirror, right? So, and people grumble along the way, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, look what's going on in cancer. I mean, these immunotherapies are insanely successful. So, and that's not necessarily a big genetics win, but yeah, I think we kind of stumble into stuff, and that's how science works. You think you've got something, and then something else comes up, and it's just this iterative process that can be really slow and frustrating. But I think we're at some tipping points now where we could start to see some pretty dramatic things. I think CRISPR is a huge leap, and who knows where that will take us. But the problem is that the common diseases, things like diabetes and these things of the immune system, they're so complicated, and you can't just go in and fix one gene and expect to have any kind of a hit on the condition. So unfortunately, there's so many bigger things that we could fix. Like, I think food, if we could fix our diets, it would have way more dramatic effect than genetics will have on our health system, for sure, without a doubt. So and there are people here at UCSF who are pounding on that door, which is really great.
All right, I'm going to open up a couple of little questions just to kind of rough the terrain out here for the later discussion here. But meanwhile, it was funny when I was talking with you earlier, you said, well, genomics is simple compared to proteomics. So kind of, to outsiders or outside the field. So we've got all this things going on in genetics, and then you started your career, I think, working on the proteomics side of things. Tell us why, what's the state of that field, and the order of difficulty, magnitude of difficulty that you've
Well, we joked around. So when I was at Applied Biosystems, I was actually the unfortunate person working on the protein side of the business instead of DNA. So the DNA, we'd have sales meetings, and the DNA people would just be cheering and rawing, and everything was great, and the protein people would be like, oh, I sold 2 machines this year. It was really depressing, and we always joked that the DNA molecule is the white-collar molecule. It sits back, and it just gets coded, and it's all great, and then the protein has to come along and actually do all the work. It's the blue-collar molecule, and it's also really difficult to sequence, and so people would look at the two fields like, I'm going to do DNA. You can make progress, you can get publications, you can make so much more progress, and so proteomics as a field just sort of limped along, and it still is kind of, it's just really hard because proteins are made up of all of these amino acids, right? I mean, there are 20, I forget if they've invented or discovered new ones, but versus DNA has 4 bases that you read. And so it's a very, like I said earlier, it's just DNA was like designed to be studied. It's so nice for technology. But protein also not only has all these different things that make it up, but then it twists and folds on itself, and you just really never know what the active part of the molecule is, and you try to map. That's something called epitope mapping, where you try to figure out, okay, where does it bind with something else? And all that three-dimensional structure to it makes it very hard to study. And so for that reason, I think it has really kept things from progressing as well as they could.
Yet it's super vital for any
Well,
health.
Everything. Proteins run everything.
So we got the DNA, which is kind of controlling it, figured out better, but the next layer down, we're really early.
We are a result of our proteins,
and
without
we're
a
in the
doubt.
really early stages of understanding that in any kind of
Yeah, I think we're, it's getting better, but it's still it's a great field to go into because it is so challenging.
One more notch. How about the microbiome? There's a lot of talk about that now. So that's another level of complexity, right?
Yeah,
Say more about
certainly.
say a little bit about that.
Well, our bodies are made up of, 10x or 100x or something crazy of foreign creatures and critters who are living in our guts and all over our whole bodies. I mean, we're just made up of these microbes. And they really, now it turns out, affect our health in really dramatic ways. They help us digest our food. They help us break down chemicals. There are just so many activities that they are performing. And we're also just on the cusp of starting to understand that. There are companies, maybe people have read about Ubiome, which is one of the early entrants in the field. Unfortunately, they've fallen on some difficult times. When they first started operating, they were just sequencing a part of the microbes, so they were just getting a little bit of a signature, and that turned out to not be that useful. And so now a lot of the companies going into it, and again, because costs are dropping on the technology, you can read the whole bacterial genome. So you can get an idea of what are all the different species that are living in your gut, and then compare that to your health. And then, of course, people are trying things like these fecal transplants, where they're trying to take stuff from other people and bring that into their own system to see if they can improve their own health. So it's a fascinating field.
Interesting. So another whole space. So as we kind of pull back here, all the different levels of new fields, tons of innovation going in it, breakthroughs in technology. But on the other hand, there's a lot of constraints, difficulties. So one thing I just wanted to raise is a couple issues that people are struggling with, like the privacy issues. Where you fall on this kind of, if someone had access to someone's DNA, that can be, the privacy concerns for a lot of people are really, really huge. I'm just wondering, is that adequately being addressed? Is that something that's going to slow down the kind of process of
Well, I think
scientific
it's more,
kind of breakthroughs and things?
I think
because
it's
we're all
more
going to get freaked
a
out about that?
perception that people have that somehow DNA information is this scary thing that if somebody gets a hold of it, that's just going to create all kinds of havoc. And certainly when we started 23andMe, we were very aware of the concerns people have around the privacy and the security of their data. So our head engineer was from PayPal, which was awesome. He was the most concerned with security of data, and he was exactly the right guy to come in and build our systems. But when we'd have conversations with people, we'd be like, okay, let's say somebody breaks into our system. We kept all of the PII, the identifiable information in a separate database from the genetic information. It would only be together when you were in your account. And unfortunately, because people didn't log in that often, it was rarely together. That's it was bad. Our service was not something that people logged into a lot. They kind of read reports once and that was it. So so your data, your A's, G's, T's, and C's are sitting over here. And somebody hacks into that and they pull out a data set, what are they truly going to be able to do with that? They don't know who it belongs to. They could maybe, and there are people who've been able to figure out plucking genetic data out of databases and identifying kind of who the person is it came from. But the bottom line is that it's just not really, and we wish that the genetic data was so interesting and readable that somebody could just come in and say, here's what I'm going to do to you because I got your data. But it's really, when you truly think it through, it's not as scary as people think.
Okay.
But that said, it's important, like any company, if you've got data from an individual, you've got to keep it secure. But from my perspective, it's really more about what does the person want to do with their data. If they want to share it, they should have that ability. We shouldn't make decisions for them as to what happens to the data. And that's certainly our philosophy at Precisely, that it's an individual's data. We'll keep it secure if they want it secure, but if they want to share it, let's enable that as well.
And how worried are you about the media or people who don't really understand the field distorting the field or getting people amped up?
Super worried.
Okay,
I hope that Rupert Murdoch doesn't decide to go after genetics.
Seriously,
he scares the hell out of me.
So you think if some media company just went berserk on the dangers of
Well, look at what happened with GMOs. And, there are some things that, and maybe that I'm not supposed to talk about that, but
no, you talk about that. We often
there are, things just get blown out of proportion. And what's the true science behind some of these things that, even scientists get on some of these bandwagons, which I watch on Twitter, and I get so frustrated that, it's complex, and there are, we need to look at things deeply, and a lot of times people just skim on the surface, and you get somebody like a Fox News, whom I am amazed people watch that, and suddenly it's in everyone's mind, and they believe it's true, and we've seen this now over and over again, and so the media has a huge role to play in this. I worry about that a ton.
Okay, and okay, so we got some concerns, got some worries, but there's people in this audience, millennials, who will live another 60 years or so, let's say.
I'm going to live another.
Okay, well, exactly. Well, that's what I'm going. So if you think of the next 40 years, which is a kind of reasonable level of many people here could live, how fundamentally different do you think it's going to be? Our healthcare, medical techniques, kind of ability to elongate life, all the things that come with that. Are you optimistic that we're entering a stage here where we're going to just get smarter and smarter and extend further and further and live better and better lives? Or are you concerned that we're not going to make the kind of progress? Well, I'm just curious. What do you think of those?
I think 40 years is going to happen like that, and that's probably because I'm getting kind of old myself. That you think things are going to happen faster, and they just don't. Things take a long time, but I bet 100 years from now, things will be pretty dramatically different. I think we will sort of be in the Gattaca stage of people are just going to be able to walk into the pharmacy, get their genetic data. They'll know what drug they should take. They'll know what drug they shouldn't take. I think all of that will be, and maybe that's even closer. Maybe that's 50 years from now. But it takes a long time. And then the medical establishment, like I think you and I, or maybe one of the Capgemini guys, we were talking about being able to walk into a doctor, and people have tried this now, or maybe it was Brett Billington, trying to walk in with your genetic data to your doctor. And I did this 15 years ago when we started 23andMe, and I went into PAMF, where I was being treated at my doctor, and I went to their CIO. I got a meeting with him, and I'm like, I'm starting this company called 23andMe, and people are going to have their genetic data. Can we upload it to our medical records here at PAMF? And he almost marched me out of his office. I mean, he just was like, what are you even talking about? And still, to this day, a lot of doctors are like, it's a plaything, it doesn't mean anything, it's not important. And this is sort of this whole PR problem, right? That there is absolutely useful information in everyone's genome. And it's just a matter of us plucking that out and being able to put it in the hands of a doctor who knows what to do with it. But Eric Topol is a really good doctor to follow on Twitter. He's kind of at the forefront of a lot of this stuff, and he wrote a book about AI in medicine, and I think there are now doctors who are starting to pick up the mantle for this, but change takes forever in the medical world. What do they say? It's like 20 years to get them to change a behavior or a treatment modality.
But are you an optimist or a pessimist about the progress we're going to see?
I think I'm a realist.
In the middle there?
Yeah.
That's a good way to step off. Okay, let's open it up to folks in this audience here. Oh gosh, there's a couple of hands going up right away. You got to run a mic, stand up, say who you are, and if you want to, put a little context of who you are, and then just join the conversation.
Hi, Linda.
Hi.
My name's Sarah Starland. I'm a freelance writer, and in February this year, I did an article about the aging brain and Alzheimer's. And I was wondering if you could, in your opinion, tell us how we should frame thinking about genetic information and getting this information, because there are a couple of contexts. One is, when I talk to doctors in the Alzheimer's field and also to the Alzheimer's Association, I wondered whether some people should get a test to see whether they have this APO4 gene, which predisposes you to getting Alzheimer's quicker than everyone else. And everyone's split on this. There's a small community of people who do it, but it's not recommended. And the Alzheimer's Association says you shouldn't do it because there's not much you can really do about it. But there are doctors like Dr. Brodesson who's come out with this New York Times bestseller that says you should get the test, get all this information, and then change your diet. To your point about food, change your diet, eat lots of greens, everyone.
No surprise.
and actually, it's the same. It's actually interesting because I feel like all the things that I learned about things being good for your brain and being good for your genes is actually good for everything else, your heart and everything else. So I was just wondering, given this sort of split in the community, how should we think about getting, when we get this information, how should we think about it? I mean, my second little question is, when you have a child in San Francisco, you can also get a genetic test for the likelihood that your child is going to get X, Y, and Z. But then something else might come out, in my personal experience, and out of left field. You think you're prepared, and then you're not. So basically, there's just all these probabilities that we're dealing with when we have this information, and you're like swimming around in a sea of data. So how should people think about it? I mean, tell us, I'm in the media. How should we frame it?
Well, I think the opportunity with something like 23andMe, it's a personal choice, and luckily, you have the option. If you want to go and get your data, you can go and do that of your own free will. And that was something that was really important to us when we started the company. We didn't think a doctor should have to be involved. You should be able to make this decision on your own. And when we would talk to people, it was almost like an immediate reaction. People were either totally for it, or they were like, I have no interest in knowing. And so it depends on the person, really. But from our mindset, and of course, because we started the company, we're pro getting your data. We think it's empowering. There are things you can do, even if it's just talking to other people. And so they started a thing at 23andMe. They have all these virtual communities that have these long threads of conversations. And there's one called the APOE Cafe. And it's just people who found out they're either 3-4 or 4-4. I'm 3-4. I've been very public about this. And it's really reassuring to go in, and people are all reading the literature, and they're all comparing notes, and they're sharing with each other. And if they think there's something they can do, they want to share it with the rest of the crowd. So you feel sort of like, I'm not alone. There are other people in the same boat. It turns out my mom is a 4-4, which means her risk, and her memory's better than mine, and she's 85 years old. So also, I love to tell that story in that community. Like, this is not, there's no proof that this is actually, and if you actually look at the stats on it, it's, yeah, you have an increased risk, but it doesn't mean by any means that you're going to get Alzheimer's. And so it's one of the reasons I drink Fiji water. I don't get paid by Fiji, but it has high silica, and there's the theory, there was some scientist who actually wanted to do a study to see if it can help pull aluminum out of your system. So, I don't like the plastic part of Fiji, but I can get it at Costco, so it's kind of cheap. So I drink a lot of Fiji water, and my husband and I are both 3-4 with ApoE, so we're kind of in it together too, which is kind of cool.
So 3-4 just means you have a very high risk, or
not very high, but it's, I forget what the numbers are, like 25% higher risk of getting Alzheimer's at some point. And it doesn't mean you get it earlier; it just means you have a higher risk of getting it at a later age. There are other genes for Alzheimer's where they're early onset, which are much scarier, and I think are more certain that you're actually going to get Alzheimer's. And then the thing with the baby, just really quick. You find out something with your child, and you want to do everything you possibly can to mitigate whatever the issue is going to be. But I still firmly believe having information is power.
Let's do Unity here. Could you stand up and identify yourself?
Hi, Unity Stokes with Startup Health. Enjoying the conversation as always. Considering you're a realist, how do we take that 100-year kind of time frame you talked about to get to this amazing dream and these amazing stories of progress and shorten that dramatically? What needs to happen? What can we do? What can innovators do? What can investors do? What needs to happen globally to just shorten that window?
Can I just, I want to out you though, because will you say a little bit about what your company is? Because you are in
so
this business.
We're Startup Health is really on a multi-decade mission to improve the health and well-being of billions of people around the world by trying to solve 11 health moonshots. We're investing in entrepreneurs around the world, connecting them together to try to speed up the innovation cycle. So we're trying to build a global army of entrepreneurs to reinvent the future and just do this more quickly as an ecosystem. So, I hear about this 29 years from 1990 to where we are now, and that just seems like extraordinary progress. But I think about what we can do over the next 29 years. And then to your point a few moments ago about when there's pressure to move more quickly, right? Things tend to happen more quickly.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I'm hoping to get some feedback that could maybe inspire all of us to maybe move the goalpost closer and get there more quickly.
Well, again, I'll go back to my food comment. I mean, genetics is great and it's a fascinating field, but we need to just get Coke and Pepsi out of the developing world, for God's fucking sake. You go to these countries and you just see that what's being dumped in these countries. It's horrendously bad, and it affects the health of all of us. We're all suffering because of our diets, and it's been because of mostly big corporate America. And how do you stop that? I don't know, Bernie, maybe.
But
That was from my friend Neil.
but totally get that. But in his specific question, I mean, do you think what if the government just put, just kind of like the genome, saying, hey, we're gonna map the genome, we're gonna go to the moon, we're gonna do these things. I mean, there are these kind of goalposts that do you think that would be useful to do in these health spaces? Like, we want to map the protein, these many proteins by 10 years or whatever it is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's going to lead to more drugs that are going to be treating people, but I would prefer, and it would be great to see something like Startup Health go after these really, and this is what like Virta Health is doing. Virta's great. I mean, they're really going in and trying to improve outcomes of people with type 2 diabetes. And he was with Trulia. He was in real estate and started this company because he saw his own health change by changing his diet. And we're seeing this more and more where we are on such a bad path when it comes to the food we eat. And there's so much dramatic change that can happen in literally weeks of people changing their diet. And I think that's the messaging we've got to get out, and we've got to really try programs that will get kids when they're younger. And we shouldn't see 4-year-olds getting type 2 diabetes. I mean, that's just insane. And so I think a dramatic improvement could happen. But do we have the will to do that? That is the big question. We believe in free will. People should be able to eat and drink whatever they want, but that's what's causing a lot of the problem in our health system.
But do you think, sorry, just to follow up, there's been billions of dollars that have been invested kind of over the last few years, and I hear from VCs, there's too much money flooding the market, there's too many startups, they're not doing, and my view is the exact opposite. Like, we haven't even started. Like, you're just moving into India, there's 168 other countries. Let's cover the whole world. That's just for genomics.
Right.
That's not microbiome. That's not food. That's not any of this other innovation. It's endless opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Trillions of dollars could be flowing in for endless innovation to radically speed progress up that could impact people's wellness, well-being, health, etc.
Yeah, and I think part of the, it was kind of radical, but in certain corners of Silicon Valley, there was excitement about Donald Trump becoming president for that very reason, that they thought, maybe this means we can do some crazy shit stuff, right? And just be able to go in and make these radical changes and just make that happen. Unfortunately, that didn't pan out, but I think we need radical change in the government to just say, okay, here's what we need to do in the schools, here's what we need to do in the companies. We've got to have taxes that are going to support companies that take out some of these really bad foods. The fast food industry is it's so bad. And it's the big, giant elephant in the room that people just don't want. We just forget about that. Like, I mean, I feed my dog the same thing every day, and he's perfectly happy eating it, and it's the perfect food for him. We need that for people. We really do. We really need to figure that out.
All right, can we see some heads here at folks that, let's go right here behind, yeah, Ron.
I'm getting punched.
And then can I see hands of people who want to ask questions if they're in the back too? I just want to understand. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. My name is Ron Martinez.
Oop, can we get that mic? Yeah, go ahead.
You got me now?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Ron Martinez. I'm an inventor, and I manage large-scale innovation and intellectual property development programs. And it struck me, you said 23andMe and Ancestry were using the exact same technology. So I was curious about the intellectual property situation with respect to at least the sequencing, and how much is that sort of an impediment, or how much does it support the development of the kind of things you're doing?
Well, so I'm sure you're very familiar with the Supreme Court ruling that came out that you couldn't patent the genome, basically. I mean, they came out finally many years ago and made that call, which I thought was the right thing.
Right.
So there really aren't the IP constraints, I wouldn't say, on at least reading the genome. And so that's a lucky result, I think, of the Supreme Court's ruling. And then, the innovation that happens is around the drugs that get developed around a target, and the target can be a genetic mutation of some kind, right? So the mutation itself isn't the important IP or the patentable information. It's really the drug that you develop on top of that. And now 23andMe is in the drug development field. They've shifted gears and gone in that direction. So now IP around the molecules that they'll identify will be the important thing. But I think it was the right move, and I was always an advocate for not patenting the actual, because you're not inventing anything. When you read the genome and you discover a gene or something, back in the day everybody was just trying to patent everything. Like, I discovered a gene, I'm going to patent it. So luckily we've advanced beyond that.
Foundation,
Yeah, exactly.
and then atop that people may be developing applications that use that open source foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Those may be subject to intellectual property capture, but the
Which is the right
fundamentals
place
are not.
to implement
Right.
it, yep.
Okay, thanks a lot.
We got a woman in the back here who had her hand up. Emma, could somebody get that?
Hi, thanks. Great talk so far. My name is Isabel, and I work in the privacy space. So a question I had, going back to your point around sort of the choice being personal of how you want to see your results and your data, but balancing that with the fact that we don't exist in silos and we have linkages in our data and with our family. And so I'm curious, how do you see that balance with, I am someone who didn't raise my hand because I am not someone who necessarily wants that information somewhere, but my sister happens to have done it and my father's happened to do it. And so what then is my right to kind of that information not being available? So I'm sure it's something you've thought about. And then a somewhat related question is then taking that further, how you think about how this data, which is very valuable and important, gets used sort of on the health insurance and sort of these more concerning uses of how we might end up seeing that data used.
Yeah. So to your first point, the genetic information, again, luckily or not luckily, it's not so determining, or doesn't determine your health outcomes that much. That's why you can see two siblings and they have completely different health. And that always kind of bugged me when the pushback against 23andMe was like, well, you've got your family history. You're fine. You'll know what you're going to have. And it's like, well, does every sibling in a family have the same health outcome? Of course not. So that's not true. Our other joke was that the bad news is that grandpa has Alzheimer's. The good news is he's not your grandfather. So that happens more often than you think. So that happened in my husband's family, actually. Joking aside, I mean, the worst thing really is that if you've got a family member walking around with a condition, what, should they put a bag over their head so we don't know that, hey, your dad, he's got Parkinson's, I mean, that to me is more, it's going to indicate more than just genetic predisposition, if you know what I mean. So, and I don't mean to, to belittle anything about you or your questions. They're all spot on in terms of how we have to think of this as a community and a society. And like the things that were going on forensics, where they were discovering these, like what was the guy's, some of these murderers who are, they're just taking the DNA from the crime scene and somehow magic happens, and then they put it into these public databases, and that's how they identify these criminals. And I'm all for that, to be honest with you, but it was not the appropriate use of those databases. All those people who'd put their data in there did not consent to that. That was not upfront. And apparently the guy who runs that, it's called GEDmatch, he's like this 81-year-old guy who made that carte blanche decision that he was going to allow law enforcement to come in and do that. He's now gone back to get consents from I forget how many million people are in that database. 80,000 people so far have agreed to do it. So the power of that now has been completely dramatically decreased. And that's a conversation that everybody should be part of. It should not be a decision made by one person by any means.
What about her health insurance question, which I thought was really interesting? I mean,
Yeah,
what do you
so-
think if insurance companies just said, hey, just part of getting this plan is you got to give us your DNA, your DNA sample?
Yeah, well, so I mean, if you talk that through to the end of if the insurers are not going to insure people who have a genetic predisposition to something, they're going to have no customers, right? I mean, they're going to find something out about just about everybody. So I think and we've had these conversations for many years now, like how can we use it as a carrot rather than a stick? And can we incentivize people to live healthier, to do the things that might prevent a disease that they're at risk for, and then work with them in a positive way rather than in a punitive way? And the insurers, I think if you talk to them, would agree with that they need to work with people who have genetic data that would maybe point at something. So I think there are opportunities to do this well and do it right. But then luckily Congress passed the GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, many years ago. Hands down, everyone approved it, where you can't be discriminated against in health and not life insurance, health insurance, and employment. So that was a good move that the government made.
Guy in the way back. Let's get someone in the way back.
Thank you. My name is Kellen Brenner. I'm with KPMG. I'm curious if and how emerging technologies are affecting your field, like AI, machine learning, quantum computing, and how that's going to speed up development if it would.
Well, for any of those things to work, you need a lot of data. So that's, I think, we always come back to that. Like AI is great, but what are we training it on, and what data are we using to actually make these big strides? But absolutely, I think in medicine, and I do encourage you to read Eric Topol's book about AI in medicine, because I think he does a really good job of kind of painting what the future is going to look like. So there's absolutely, and there's so much tremendously sophisticated and complex data that we need to, and human beings have no ability. Let's just admit it. We don't have the ability to sift through all of that and recognize those patterns. And so there are use cases for all of that, for sure.
Possibly accelerating things. I feel like, is anyone in this section here? Because we haven't, okay, let's get this in the front here, Marty. I don't want to discriminate against this side here.
Marty Krasny, I'm a writer and educator, and I'm not a scientist, so this is a very naive question, but I'll invoke Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels to give it a little bit more status. Can you envision a time when people will live 150 years, 200 years, infinite? Then the second question is, what do you feed your dog?
Oh, he does love it. So, yeah, I'm not a person who's really into the anti-aging stuff. I do take the what's it called? The Elysium, the NR, the nicotinamide riboside, which is it's a precursor for NAD. There was a big article about NAD, and I figure, what the heck? Yeah, I think there are tweaks that we're going to be able to do. I think 150 is probably going to happen relatively soon. Unfortunately, it's going to be in wealthy people. It's not going to be something, and we're seeing the healthcare of the poorer part of the population on the decline. So I would rather that we spent more time trying to improve the health of everyone rather than billionaires being able to age well. But I think there are people willing to pay for it, so it's probably going to happen.
Well, when you say 150, why do you think that's just, why are you so clear that that's probably going to happen?
Well, it's we have people living into, and it's not common, but in the 120s, and all of my grandmothers lived to over 100 or thereabouts, and so I feel like I've lived a much healthier life than they did. I exercise a lot more. I think I'm watching what I eat a lot more. So I think there are just small tweaks that we can do to get to those kinds of numbers, like the 150 possibly. But then to go much beyond that, then you're talking Ray Kurzweil, and that's not my gig. That's not my bag.
Interesting. Okay, so let's get here.
Oh, dog food. I don't know. My husband buys it. I have no idea.
The middle here, and can I see hands again, just to understand who's in? Okay, good. Good.
Hi, Ron Stoltz. So I worked at the interface between government research and private research. And I've been looking and thinking about systemic change. And one of the things that struck me, and it's informed by the idea that Kaiser Permanente, the system, might build their own medical school to train doctors in the Kaiser way, which is evidence-based medicine. So my question is, have you ever heard of anyone proposing to build a medical school which has part of its core curriculum the genetics? And if not, what might the community here think stands in the way of that? Because I think that the way you can get systemic change and to speed up that slow introduction among doctors is to go to the education system that they're trained under. And that hasn't changed much over time. So my question is, have you ever heard of that, and do you think that's a good idea?
Well, Stanford actually in their med school, they offer a course. It's not required, but part of the course is that all of the students do something like 23andMe, and they don't have to do the test. They can get a fake genome that they borrow for the course. But Stanford, I think, is one of the more advanced schools that is really trying to bring it in, but in a way that's not, it's not being forced. Because part of the problem is we still don't know a lot about what the genome does in terms of medical care. But we've talked to, in fact, we were going to try to do a program that was 23 and CME. To try to get into the CMA courses, and that just didn't end up going anywhere. Well, the whole CMA program changed a lot. They took money out of, it used to be these boondoggle trips that doctors could go on these great vacations, and they do a little coursework, and it was all great. And a lot of that kind of went away, and so there weren't those opportunities to do something kind of cool like that. But yeah, I think it could take having new med schools that are changing the curriculum dramatically to start to bring this information into the training from the get-go. And I do think that could be a great way to do some experimenting. No, not at all. No.
Okay, we're going to do the last few questions here. We get it run here. And okay, then we got, you want to run?
Two quick things. One, it's my understanding that the medical schools have figured out the mineral etiology of all illnesses, and that a lot of the reason that the animals are healthier than people is because they've got all this stuff in the food, and so the animals actually have food that prevents illness, and the dog food and all of that stuff. But the question I have for you is, I've been watching Designated Survivor on Netflix, and really enjoying it. And the 23andMe is mentioned in it, and there's
seriously.
Yeah, and it's a big part
Kiefer
of the
Sutherland?
second season and the third season, and it's really interesting the way they cover it. And then they're also talking about bioterror and other things. It's a very interesting show as a current study of current affairs. And I just wondered if you were aware of that, how they covered it, if they were working with the company to get that information, or they just pulled it out and put it in the script. But they did a great job. I mean, I don't know whether they did or not. I was kind of asking whether.
And I have to say I watched the first season of that, and then I didn't watch it anymore. So I'll need to go back and watch it to see. Okay. All right, I'll check that out.
Do you? But you just raised a couple of interesting questions though, about bioterrorism, manipulating, genes.
Talking about CRISPR a lot in the first
using CRISPR to create kind of pandemics and stuff. I mean, I don't know what that. I haven't watched the show, but is that, we didn't really touch on that, but is that something that worries you? Someone that's in the space and understands what can be done and what can't be done? And
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
say more about what worries you about it. I mean, this is closer. That could happen easier than people think.
No, I don't think it's easier than. I think it's still pretty challenging to do these things, but it's a possibility. But it's not something I lose sleep over. But I'm surprised more things haven't happened in the bioweapon space. To be
Really?
honest, yeah.
Well, that's comforting. Okay.
Just
Our expert in genetics
just watch
is like
Designated Survivor. You'll be fine.
All right. Okay, we're gonna have.
Hi, I'm Michael Perlmutter. I'm also an inventor and have managed intellectual property as well. I'm sort of a little bit back on the question that was asked before, that had to do with the privacy that is affected by your relatives
Hold on,
getting
hold
into
on.
the database. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this gene match thing, so if I also one of the people who didn't raise my hand, although I'm a very curious person and would like to do it. Does that happen by default? Do I have to uncheck something to make sure that my genetic information is not sent to that database?
Well, you have to proactively send it there.
You have to proactively send it there
Yes.
as a separate
So,
thing.
and a lot of people did that because they were looking for relatives, and so they were doing it for more of the ancestry purposes. And so it was a very voluntary action that people would put their data there. Whereas 23andMe and Ancestry, the company, will not allow someone to come in and just upload a data set and search through and see where
And
the
it's not
matches
like
are.
a checkbox that's checked by default that you would have to notice and uncheck
No,
in
no,
order to make
not
sure
at
it's not
23andMe
sent.
and Ancestry. No, no,
Right.
no, no, no.
And,
I mean,
and when it's sent, they are sending your personal identification information as well so that they can find your ancestors, I assume. I mean, your relatives.
yeah,
Right.
I'm not quite sure how that works. I've never played with GEDmatch, so I don't really know how it operates. But presumably, yeah, I mean, there must be, people probably consent to say I'm reachable if somebody finds me and I look like I'm related. And that's how it is in 23andMe too, where you personally can go and find your relatives, but nobody else can come and put data in and compare it to you without you knowing about it. So there are stopgaps that can be put into
I
place.
had planned a career as a serial killer, but then I found out that both my mother and my father had done 23andMe separately. And I'm like, okay, that's it.
Yay,
But-
win for
but
23andMe.
By the way, if we want to affect the diet, which we all really do, let's get the government to stop subsidizing corn and
thank
corn
you,
syrup.
yes. Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Just that alone, right? If
Exactly.
we just stop
Exactly.
subsidizing corn.
Exactly. Yes, that's a huge thing.
All right, we're gonna wind it up here. But what I wanted to just do is, for the people who are just coming into this event and where you are now, are you more optimistic about what's on the horizon here, or are you more concerned about what's going on? So let's see those who are more